If you're too scared to handle true horror, you might want to turn away now. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a warning. A reminder that some places in this world hold secrets so dark, so hungry, they wait quietly for the right moment to devour. If you think you're safe in your own home, behind locked doors, think again. The story of the quiet lake is not just a nightmare, it's a slow descent into something you might never escape. The Anderson family had always dreamed of a peaceful summer getaway. The lake had called to them, quiet, still, and undisturbed. The idea of escaping the noise of the city, the blaring horns, and the constant hum of machines felt like a blessing. They packed their bags in the warm glow of June's sun, and the children, Ben, aged 10, and Sophie, age 6, chattered with excitement in the back seat as their car rumbled along the winding country road. The journey was long, but the anticipation kept the family energized. Trees blurred past the windows, tall and green, as if they were silently watching the family's approach. The further they drove, the denser the woods became, and the more the air seemed to hum with an odd, almost electric stillness. Finally, the cabin came into view, a small, weathered structure nestled at the edge of a placid lake. The water, a dark, glassy mirror, reflected the towering pines that framed the scene. Mr. Anderson stepped out first, stretching and breathing in the fresh air, while Mrs. Anderson helped the children out of the car. The cabin seemed almost too perfect. Its wooden porch sagged slightly, the windows coated in a thin layer of dust, as though it had been waiting for them. Ben raced toward the water's edge, the pebbles crunching beneath his sneakers. Sophie followed, her laughter echoing across the still lake. The parents smiled, but their eyes held a quiet unease, as if they both sensed something strange about the place. A breeze stirred the leaves, and the lake rippled just slightly, as if in response to the children's arrival. As the family settled in, unpacking bags and exploring the small cabin, an odd silence settled around them. There were no birds chirping, no insects buzzing, only the faint, almost imperceptible sound of water lapping against the shore. The air felt heavy, the kind that clings to your skin and makes you shiver even in the warmth of the sun. That night, as the sun dipped low and the sky bruised into shades of purple and black, the family gathered on the porch. Mr. Anderson pointed out constellations, while the children tried to spot shooting stars. The lake glistened in the moonlight, eerily calm, almost too calm. And then, as if someone had flicked a switch, the air shifted. Sophie paused mid-laugh, her head tilting slightly as if listening for something. Her eyes widened, and she whispered, "Did you hear that?" The family fell silent. For a long moment, there was nothing but the soft rustle of leaves. And then, the faintest whisper. It was so soft, so delicate, it could have been mistaken for the wind. But it wasn't the wind. Mr. Anderson shook his head, forcing a smile. "Just the woods settling in for the night," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But Sophie wasn't convinced. She held onto her mother's hand tightly, her small fingers trembling. Mrs. Anderson shushed her gently, stroking her hair, though she, too, glanced nervously toward the darkened tree line. As they prepared to head inside, Ben lingered by the porch steps, staring out at the lake. His breath caught in his throat, and his eyes seemed to glaze over as he whispered, "It's calling." Mr. Anderson gently ushered him inside, but as they closed the door behind them, the faint sound of whispering continued just beneath the surface of the lake, like a secret waiting to be heard. The morning light spilled across the lake in soft ribbons of gold, but the quiet unease from the night before lingered like a thin fog clinging to the trees. The Andersons stirred slowly, shaking off the remnants of sleep. Mrs. Anderson brewed a pot of coffee while the children tugged on their shoes, eager to explore the world outside. Mr. Anderson stepped onto the porch, inhaling deeply, hoping the fresh air would wash away the strange feeling that had settled in his chest. The family decided to spend the morning by the lake, dipping their toes in the water and skipping stones across its surface. The lake seemed so serene, smooth as glass, barely a ripple disturbing its surface. The sunlight danced off the water, and for a moment, it felt as if the odd whispers from the night before had been nothing more than imagination. But then the breeze shifted. A hush swept across the landscape, the sound of the wind replaced by something softer, more insidious and almost imperceptible whispering that seemed to float up from the lake itself. It was a sound that didn't belong to rhythmic to be nature, too subtle to be dismissed. It was there, and it wasn't the wind. Ben stood near the shore, his eyes narrowed, head tilted slightly as if listening. Sophie giggled, chasing after a butterfly, but her laughter faltered as she glanced toward the water. Her steps slowed and she frowned. "Why is it so quiet, Daddy?" she asked softly, her voice barely a breath. Mr. Anderson tried to brush it off with a smile, ruffling Sophie's hair. "It's just peaceful out here, kiddo. That's what we wanted, remember?" But his words tasted like lies in his mouth. Ben threw a stone into the lake, and the water rippled outward in perfect circles. As they watched, the ripples seemed to slow unnaturally, the water shivering beneath the sun's reflection. The family stared, transfixed, as the circles spread wider and wider until they seemed to vanish beneath the surface. And then, the whispering returned, soft at first, like a murmur carried on the wind, and then louder, more insistent. It was a whisper that felt like it was crawling inside their ears, wrapping around their thoughts, seeping into their bones. Ben's hands clenched into fists, his body rigid. "They're talking," he muttered, his voice low and distant. Mrs. Anderson's head snapped toward him, her heart racing. "Who, Ben? Who's talking?" But Ben didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the water, as if something unseen was staring back at him from beneath the surface. Sophie clung to her mother's leg, her small face pale, eyes wide with confusion and fear. The whispers grew louder, threading through the family's thoughts like smoke. They couldn't make out the words, only the soft, urgent tones, like pleading voices trapped just beyond reach. The air felt colder now despite the sun, and the family shivered involuntarily. Mr. Anderson shook himself, forcing a laugh that rang hollow in the stillness. "Come on, kids," he said, a little too loud. "Let's go back inside. Maybe we'll take a walk into town later." But as they turned to leave, a faint splash echoed from the lake. They stopped, turning back slowly. There was nothing, just the smooth, dark surface of the water. No ripples, no movement, no sign of whatever had made the sound. And then they saw it, just for a moment, a figure, or the suggestion of one, standing at the far edge of the lake. It was too far to make out clearly, and yet it seemed to shimmer, as if caught in the heat haze of summer, shifting and pulsing at the edges. Mrs. Anderson's breath caught in her throat. She reached out, gripping Mr. Anderson's arm tightly. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Anderson stared, squinting against the glare of the sun. The figure, or whatever it was, seemed to melt into the shadows of the trees, vanishing as if it had never been there. Then spoke again, his voice flat, eyes still locked on the water. "They're waiting." The words sent a shiver down Mrs. Anderson's spine. She looked at her husband, her eyes searching his for answers, but he had none to give. He only took her hand and guided the children back toward the cabin, his steps quick and uneven, his heart pounding in his chest. Behind them, the lake sat still and quiet, but the whispers never truly stopped. The day wore on, the sun arcing across the sky, but the weight in the air never lifted. The Andersons tried to shake off the unease that clung to them like a damp fog. They ate lunch on the porch, sandwiches that tasted of nothing, the bread dry in their mouths. The children pushed food around their plates, glancing nervously at the lake. Mrs. Anderson suggested a walk, something to distract them. The trees lining the lake's edge seemed like a safer option than staring at that still, dark water. They packed a small bag and set off down a narrow trail, winding through the woods. The air was cooler in the shade, but the silence was sharper. No birds sang, no insect sound, only the crunch of dry leaves beneath their shoes and the occasional snap of a twig. Ben lingered behind, dragging a stick through the dirt. He kept glancing back toward the lake, his steps slower, his expression distant. Sophie clutched her mother's hand tightly, her little eyes wide, darting left and right. As they reached a small clearing, the wind picked up. It swept through the trees with a strange, hollow sound, as if the woods were breathing. The family stopped, listening. The wind fell away, leaving behind a deeper silence. And then, the whispers returned, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves. But they weren't leaves, Sophie whimpered, tugging on her mother's hand. Mrs. Anderson hushed her gently, trying to stay calm, but her own breath was shallow. Mr. Anderson scanned the trees, his eyes narrowing as if searching for the source of the whispers. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, drifting through the branches, curling around their thoughts. Then stopped, his body tense. He turned slowly toward a cluster of trees at the edge of the clearing, his voice a whisper itself. "There's someone there." The family followed his gaze, but they saw nothing, just shadows pooling at the base of the trees. The wind stirred again, and for a fleeting moment, the shadows seemed to shift. A figure appeared, faint, almost translucent, as if woven from mist. It stood just beyond the tree line, its shape human, but wrong. The head tilted slightly, watching. Mrs. Anderson's heart thundered in her chest. She took a step back, pulling Sophie with her. Mr. Anderson's voice was low, trembling. "We're leaving, now." But then stood frozen, his eyes wide, locked onto the figure. His lips moved, barely forming words. "It knows my name." The whispers swelled, rising and falling like a distant chant. The family turned, hurrying back along the path, their footsteps quick and uneven. The trees seemed to close in around them, the air colder now, heavy with unseen eyes. As they walked, the light shifted strangely, casting long shadows across the trail. Sophie stumbled, her small body trembling as she clutched at her mother's side, then walked stiffly, as if he couldn't hear them anymore, his head turning slightly, as though listening to a voice that no one else could hear. They reached the cabin breathless, and slammed the door behind them. The whispers faded, swallowed by the thick wooden walls, but the sense of dread lingered. The family sat in the dim living room, the only sound their ragged breathing. Mrs. Anderson glanced at her husband, her voice barely a whisper. "What is happening?" He shook his head slowly, unable to answer, his eyes dark with fear. The water reflected the light, but it seemed darker now, almost as if it were absorbing the sun's rays rather than reflecting them. And as the light faded, the whispers returned, softer, but constant, like a distant, endless lullaby. That night, as they lay in bed, Sophie clung to her stuffed bunny, eyes wide open in the dark, then lay still, staring at the ceiling, his lips moving silently. And outside, beneath the soft glow of the moon, something moved along the shoreline. It paused at the water's edge, its shape indistinct, watching the cabin as the night deepened around it. Night settled in like a heavy blanket, thick and suffocating. The cabin creaked with every gust of wind, the old wood groaning in protest. The Andersons huddled together in the living room, the dim lamp casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. The children were restless, Sophie's small body shivering in her mother's arms, Ben staring blankly at the darkened window, his face pale and hollow. They tried to pretend it was just the woods, just the wind, just their imaginations running wild. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the whispers returned, this time closer. They drifted through the thin walls of the cabin, curling into the quiet spaces between breaths. They weren't words exactly, more like fragments of thoughts, snatches of sentences, broken voices carried by the night. Sophie whimpered softly, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. "Make it stop, Mommy," she whispered. Mrs. Anderson smoothed her hair, her hands shaking. "It's just the wind, sweetheart, just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. The lamp flickered, the light stuttering, casting shadows that seemed to shift and sway on their own. Ben's eyes darted around the room, wide and unblinking. "They're in here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. His words sent a cold shiver through the room, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your stomach knot. Mr. Anderson moved to the window, peering out into the dark. The lake lay still, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the pale sliver of moonlight. But there was movement just at the edge of the trees. A figure, or perhaps a collection of them, shifting between the trunks, barely visible in the gloom. They seemed to glide, their forms blurring at the edges, as if the night itself were pulling them apart. He closed the curtains quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. The lamp flickered again, and then, without warning, the lights cut out completely. The cabin plunged into darkness. Sophie screamed, a high, thin sound that cut through the silence. Mrs. Anderson wrapped her arms around her tightly, whispering soothing nonsense. Mr. Anderson fumbled for a flashlight, his hands shaking. When he flicked it on, the beam quivered across the walls, the light pale and weak, barely piercing the blackness. The whispers grew louder in the dark, as if emboldened by the absence of light. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the floor, from the very air. The sound was everywhere, filling the cabin with an oppressive, suffocating presence. Then came a soft, deliberate knock. It echoed through the cabin, a slow, hollow sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Knock, 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 knock. The sound was patient, unhurried, as if whoever, or whatever, was outside knew there was no need to rush. There was no one there, just the old wooden frame, the handle unmoving. But the knocks continued, steady and insistent. Sophie began to sob, the sound high and panicked. Ben, strangely calm, turned his head toward the door and whispered, "They're coming in." The words sent ice down Mrs. Anderson's spine. She grabbed Sophie tighter, rocking her gently. "It's nothing. Just a branch in the wind," she whispered. But even she didn't believe it. Mr. Anderson took a step toward the door, the flashlight trembling in his grip. He placed his hand on the handle, frozen for a moment, torn between opening the door and running away from it. The knock stopped. Silence. And then, from the window, a whisper, clear this time, distinct, just behind the glass. "Let us in." The voice was soft, almost pleading, but fretted with something darker, an undercurrent of hunger, of need. Mr. Anderson staggered back, dropping the flashlight. The beam swung wildly, landing on Ben's face. Mrs. Anderson's voice was tight, almost a whisper. "Ben, what's wrong?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes dark and hollow. "They're calling me." The whispers drifted on the wind, circling the cabin like a noose tightening. The darkness inside the cabin seemed to pulse alive with a quiet, oppressive weight. The whispers lingered like mist in the corners, slipping through cracks in the floorboards, curling into the family's ears. The small beam of the dropped flashlight cast eerie shapes across the walls, twisting, shifting shadows that seemed to stretch too long, like something unseen was moving just out of reach. Mr. Anderson picked up the flashlight, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath came in shallow gasps, each inhale a struggle against the thick air. He pointed the light toward the window, half expecting to see a face staring back at him, pressed against the glass. But there was nothing, only the lake beyond, its surface unnaturally still, as if it were holding its breath. Ben sat quietly now, unnervingly calm, his small hands resting on his knees. His eyes were wide, glassy, staring at nothing in particular. He whispered softly, a sing-song tone threading through his words. They're waiting by the water. They know we're here." Mrs. Anderson clutched Sophie tightly, rocking her back and forth, her own tears falling onto the child's hair. Sophie sobbed quietly, her body shaking, while outside, the wind rattled the thin window panes. The cabin groaned again, the wooden walls creaking like old bones bending under some unseen pressure. And then the knocking returned, soft at first but slow. Measured. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't frantic, it was deliberate, as if the thing outside had all the time in the world. The sound echoed in the family's chests, thudding in time with their racing hearts. The flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering, and then went dark. The room plunged into near total blackness. Mrs. Anderson's voice broke the silence, a raw, desperate whisper. "What do we do? Oh God, what do we do?" Mr. Anderson's voice was hoarse. "Stay calm, don't open the door. Don't let them in." But the knocking continued, growing louder now, faster, more urgent. It moved first at the door, then at the walls, then at the windows, as if the cabin were surrounded. The sound came from everywhere at once, filling the small space with its relentless rhythm. Sophie clamped her hands over her ears, sobbing harder, and then the whispers seeped through again, threading between the knocks, curling into the family's minds. They spoke in fragments, soft and insistent. "Come to us, come to the water. You're not alone." Ben stood suddenly, his small frame stiff, and began walking toward the door. His bare feet moved soundlessly across the old wooden floor, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to some invisible guide. Mrs. Anderson lunged forward, grabbing him by the arm, pulling him back. "No, Ben, no." He struggled against her, not violently, but with a strange, quiet determination. His voice was flat, distant. "They're waiting for me, Mom. They said it's okay." Mr. Anderson moved toward the door, blocking it with his body, the flashlight raised like a weapon, though it was dim and sputtering. His heart raced, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He felt the vibrations now, the knocking shaking the walls, the whispers slithering through the floorboards, the windows, the very air. It was as if the entire cabin had become a drum, the sound building and building. The walls seemed to bend, the wood groaning under the pressure. The air grew colder, and the shadows stretched, crawling across the floor like dark, reaching hands. Then, in an instant, the knocking stopped. The whispers fell silent. The cabin seemed to exhale, the air heavy and still once more. For a long moment, no one moved. The family sat frozen in the dark, listening, waiting, their breaths sharp and shallow. The silence was deafening, like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. And then, just as Mrs. Anderson dared to hope the worst had passed, there was a soft, slow scrape across the window glass. It was the unmistakable sound of nails dragging across the pane. Sophie whimpered, burying her face deeper into her mother's chest. Mr. Anderson turned, the flashlight beam swinging toward the sound. The light caught on the window, and for a split second there was a shape, a pale, elongated hand pressed against the glass, fingers splayed wide, the skin wet and glistening, like something that had been in the water for far too long. The family's screams shattered the silence. The moment stretched, brittle and breathless, as the pale hand dragged slowly down the glass, leaving behind a faint, glistening smear. It was there for a heartbeat, long fingers, too long, each joint bending at impossible angles, the skin translucent, slick, as if it had been submerged for far too long. And then it was gone. The hand melted into the darkness, the window left bare and cold. Mr. Anderson stumbled back, the flashlight beam quivering wildly, catching glimpses of the room in jagged bursts of light and shadow. His breath came in sharp, ragged pulls, and he felt the cold sweat sliding down his spine. The whispers had returned, soft but constant, like a lullaby meant for something that should never have been born. They whispered from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very air. Ben's voice cut through the hush, low, distant. "They want Daddy." The words were barely a whisper, but they froze Mrs. Anderson in place. Her hands tightened around Sophie, who sobbed quietly, trembling like a leaf. Mr. Anderson turned sharply, his eyes wide, throat tightening. "What did you say?" Ben's head tilted, his gaze blank and far away. "They're calling for you, Daddy. They said you have to come. They're waiting by the water." The flashlight flickered again, and then blackness. The cabin groaned, the walls creaking as if the wood itself was twisting under an unseen weight. The sound of footsteps began, soft and deliberate, pacing around the cabin. Slow, measured steps. They circled the house outside at first, but then, inside. The steps shifted, creaking across the floor, moving down the hall, drawing closer. Mr. Anderson gripped the flashlight tighter, shaking it, willing the light to return. It stuttered to life for a moment, and in that brief flash, he saw them wet footprints smeared across the wooden floor, leading from the window toward the back door. His heart hammered, his hands trembled. He took a step forward, but the floor beneath his feet groaned. the sound deep and strange like the moan of something ancient and heavy. The air grew colder still, sharp enough to sting his lungs. The footsteps stopped. The whispers surged, no longer gentle, urgent now, pressing against the family's thoughts, weaving in and out of their panic. Mr. Anderson felt them inside his head, whispering his name over and over, a chant, a beckoning. He clutched at his temples, the pressure unbearable. Ben's voice rose, distant but clear. "Daddy, they want you to see the lake. They said it's beautiful in the dark." The words sent a shudder through the room. Mrs. Anderson clutched Sophie tighter, rocking her gently, whispering softly, "It's okay. It's okay. We're safe." But she didn't believe it. Mr. Anderson stumbled toward the back door, as if pulled by an unseen thread. His hand hovered over the handle, breath hitching. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him, pulling him forward. His fingers brushed the cold metal, and then, from the other side of the door, a soft knock. Once, twice. Slow, patient, "Come to us," a voice breathed, so close it seemed to seep through the wood. He jerked his hand back, heart racing, stepping away from the door. The sound followed another slow knock, deliberate, as if the thing outside knew he wouldn't be able to resist forever. Ben's voice called out again, sing-song and strange. "They're waiting, Daddy. Don't be scared." Mr. Anderson's legs trembled. The air felt thick, like breathing through water. The whispers wrapped around his thoughts, squeezing, pulling. The urge to open the door was overwhelming, almost like hunger, an ache that gnawed at his bones. Mrs. Anderson's voice cut through, sharp and pleading. "Don't, please, don't open it." Her words snapped him back, and he stumbled away from the door, panting, shaking his head, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. The whispers hissed in frustration, but the door stayed shut. For now. Outside, the lake glimmered darkly under the pale moonlight, its surface rippling faintly. Something moved along the shoreline, pale shapes, barely visible, slipping in and out of the shadows. The trees leaned in closer, their branches swaying as if listening. Inside, the family sat huddled together, the darkness pressing in, the whispers never ceasing. The air was heavy, cold, and full of unseen eyes. And somewhere out there, beyond the walls, the lake waited, its surface still and black, whispering softly into the night. The cabin seemed to inhale and exhale around them, its wooden walls expanding and contracting with a slow, unsettling rhythm. The Andersons sat huddled close in the living room, bodies pressed tight as if the nearness alone could hold back the dark pressing in from all sides. Sophie clung to her mother, her little hands white-knuckled and shaking. Ben sat eerily still, his gaze distant, lips moving in a silent conversation only he could hear. The whispers never stopped. They shifted and swirled, a soft, persistent murmur like the faint sigh of the lake, sometimes barely there, sometimes so loud it seemed to pulse inside the family's heads. And then came the knocking again. But this time, it wasn't just the door. Soft, patient, relentless. Mr. Anderson swung the flashlight toward the sound, the beam shaking wildly, sweeping over the curtains, the faded rug, the scuffed shoes by the door. Nothing there, only the sound, steady, rhythmic knock, knock, not growing louder, creeping closer. The knocks shifted at the windows now, then the back wall, then beneath the floor under Ben's feet. The boy's head turned slowly, his eyes dark and glazed. He lifted a hand, fingers twitching, and whispered, "They want to come inside." A shiver coursed through the room. Mrs. Anderson's breath caught, her arms tightening around Sophie, who trembled, small and soft, tears streaking her cheeks. Mr. Anderson's voice came out thin, hoarse, barely audible above the growing whispers. "They're not coming in. They can't. We won't let them." But Ben's lips curled into a faint, strange smile. "They already are." The floor beneath them groaned a low, splintering sound as if something immense was pressing down from above. Then a sudden, sharp thud against the wall, rattling the lamp on the side table. The sound sharp in the dark. And then the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps. Light there. Careful. They started in the hallway near the bedroom, slow, steady, moving closer with each soft step. Mrs. Anderson froze, her breath catching in her throat. Sophie whimpered in her arms, pressing her small body tightly against her mother's chest, tiny hands gripping fabric in a desperate clutch. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell tense, brittle, holding the air tight between them. Then a voice, barely a whisper, drifted from the hallway. "Mommy." Mrs. Anderson's eyes flew wide, her pulse crashing in her ears. It was Sophie's voice, but Sophie was right there, sobbing softly in her lap. The voice called again, drifting closer. "Mommy, I'm scared." Her heart pounded, the sound loud in her skull, twisting confusion and dread into a knot in her chest. She held Sophie tighter, feeling her child's tears dampen her shirt. The footsteps started again, soft and deliberate, moving across the floor. The voice drifted closer still. "Mommy, please, I'm lost." Ben's head tilted toward the sound, his dark eyes gleaming, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. His whisper chilled the air. "It's not her." The footsteps stopped just outside the living room doorway. Silence stretched, caught as a wire, and then soft tapping. Fingernails, maybe delicate, rhythmic, brushing against the wall. Tap dot tap, tap dot. Mrs. Anderson's voice cracked, raw and pleading. "Go away, please, go away." But the voice answered, soft, almost gentle. "Let me in, Mommy. I'm cold. I'm so cold." The whispers thickened, pressing in, filling the space like fog, heavy and suffocating. The cabin itself seemed to shrink, the walls bending inward, the air thinning under the weight of something unseen. Sophie whimpered, her voice muffled against her mother's chest. "Mommy." "Make it stop." Mr. Anderson's grip tightened on the flashlight, the beam shivering in his shaking hands. He aimed it at the doorway, light trembling, landing on nothing, just empty space, dark and waiting. Then the knocking started again, faster this time, urgent, frantic. Fists, it seemed, slamming against the walls, the floor, the windows, pounding from every side. The cabin shuddered with the force, the sound vibrating deep in their chests. And then, the most terrible sound of all, a soft, wet asterisk dragging asterisk, moving across the floorboards. Slow, steady, deliberate, as though something heavy and slick were being pulled toward them, inch by inch. Mr. Anderson's voice cracked, low and desperate, barely more than a breath. "Where's Ben?" Mrs. Anderson's breath stuttered, sharp and broken. She looked down. The boy was gone. A sharp gasp tore from Mrs. Anderson's throat, her head snapping around wildly. The space where Ben had been sitting was empty. His small, warm body, once pressed close, was gone, vanished into the dark. The flashlight beam swung erratically across the room, cutting through shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in its wake. "Ben," she cried, her voice hoarse with terror. Sophie whimpered in her arms, clinging tighter, her small body trembling. Mr. Anderson was already moving, the flashlight jittering in his unsteady hand, its beam catching flashes of the walls, the floor, the doorways. The whispers surged louder now, a chaotic tangle of voices overlapping in a language that wasn't quite words, but somehow spoke straight into the mind. The floor creaked in the hallway. "Ben?" Mr. Anderson shouted, his voice raw, pushing through the fog of whispers. He stumbled forward, past the flickering shadows, heart hammering so hard it was all he could hear. He paused in the narrow hallway, the air thick and heavy, the walls pulsing in and out of focus. And then a sound, a faint, childlike giggle, soft and sweet, floated from the direction of the back door. Mr. Anderson's blood ran cold. His skin prickled with a fear so sharp it felt like needles pressing into his flesh. That sound, it was Ben's laugh. But not quite. It was the soft and slow, like it had been stretched thin and warped by something else entirely. He turned sharply, the flashlight beam swinging to the door. The handle was moving. It twisted slowly, creaking as if unseen hands were testing it, feeling the metal under cold, slit fingers. The wood around it shivered, the whispers pressing through the thin barrier. "Ben!" Mr. Anderson roared, lunging for the door, slamming his body against it. The handle stopped turning, but the air on the other side of the door seemed to pulse, as if something was waiting just beyond the threshold, patient and hungry. Sophie was no longer in Mrs. Anderson's arms. The blanket she had been wrapped in lay crumpled on the floor. Mrs. Anderson's breath came in short, ragged gasps. The whispers surged again, louder, urgent now, filling the cabin like a tide rising to drown them all. They spoke in fragments, names, pleas, soft laughter that didn't belong. Mr. Anderson turned back to the door. His voice was a low, shaking command. "Stay here. Don't move. I'll find them." But Mrs. Anderson's hands gripped his sleeve tightly, her eyes wide and wild. "No, don't go. Please, don't." He tore free, the flashlight being jittering in front of him. His breath burned in his chest as he moved down the hallway toward the back door. The whispers thickened, curling around him, pulling at the edges of his thoughts. They seemed to seep into his skin, sliding cold tendrils into his mind, threading through his memories, twisting his sense of time and space. The air near the back door shimmered, warping the space like heat rising from asphalt. The door pulsed slightly, as if breathing. He reached out, hand trembling, heart hammering so loudly it drowned out the whispers for a moment. And then, from just beyond the door, a soft, small voice. "Daddy, I'm cold." It was Sophie's voice, sweet, frightened, but it was wrong. The tone was flat, the words too slow, too careful, like they were being repeated by someone who had never spoken before. Mr. Anderson's breath caught in his throat, his body locked in place, torn between the need to protect and the knowledge that whatever was speaking wasn't his daughter. The whispers pressed closer, wrapping around him like smoke, whispering his name in soft, rhythmic waves. "Come to the water. Come see the lake. It's waiting. It's waiting." His hand hovered over the handle, frozen. Then a sudden, sharp knock burst from the floor beneath his feet. He stumbled back, flashlight beam jerking downward. His eyes widened in horror. There, on the old wood planks, wet footprints. Small dot there, leading away from the door, back toward the living room, and into the hallway beyond. "Sophie." Mrs. Anderson's voice cracked behind him, barely a whisper. The flashlight beam followed the prints, his breath catching in shallow gasps. They disappeared into the dark, swallowed by the cabin's endless, hungry shadows. The lake whispered louder now, its call rising like a siren song, pulsing through the walls, vibrating in their bones. And somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of children's laughter floated on the air, sweet and hollow, as if carried on a breath from beneath the water. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, thick like syrup, pressing down on their lungs with every breath. The wet footprints gleamed faintly on the floorboards, a glistening trail of quiet dread that led deeper into the house. Mrs. Anderson's breath hitched, a ragged sound that caught in her throat as she stared, wide-eyed, at the prints. She clutched the blanket that had once been wrapped around Sophie, her fingers digging into the fabric until her knuckles went white. Her voice was a thin, shaking whisper. They took them. They took our babies." Mr. Anderson turned toward her, eyes hollow, face pale, and slick with sweat. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. The whispers surged again, louder, rising and falling in waves. They pulsed through the room, sliding into the spaces between breaths, threading into the very air like invisible hands. The whispers seemed to twist around the family's thoughts, pulling at the edges of reason, fraying the threads that held their minds together. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were asterisk inside asterisk, filling their heads with half-formed images and flashes of something deep beneath the lake surface. Dark shapes, barely seen, faces pressed against the water's skin, mouths moving, eyes wide and unblinking. The sense of something ancient, something patient, waiting. Ben's voice floated back from the darkness, a soft, sing-song tone that chilled the blood in their veins. "They're under the water. They sleep in the deep. They're calling us." Mrs. Anderson let out a sob, burying her face in her hands, rocking back and forth, as if she could disappear into herself. Mr. Anderson clenched his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms, the pain grounding him for a moment. "No," he whispered, shaking his head, trying to drown out the voices, the whispers that wormed into his thoughts. "No, no, no." The footprints trailed down the hallway leading to the old wooden door at the end, the one that hadn't been opened yet, the one that had seemed harmless when they'd first arrived. Mr. Anderson swallowed hard, the air catching in his throat like a stone. His steps were slow, heavy, each one a battle against the invisible weight pulling him back. The flashlight flickered as he moved, the beam jittering across the walls, revealing glimpses of dark stains he hadn't noticed before, faint like something wet had seeped into the wood long ago. Mrs. Anderson followed, her breath ragged, a soft, gasping sob escaping with every step. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, threading through her like cold fingers curling around her ribs. She tried to cover her ears, but it did nothing. The voices were inside her head now, whispering in a language she didn't understand, but felt deep in her bones, in the hollow space behind her eyes. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, don't go." But Mr. Anderson had already reached the door. He paused, hand trembling as it hovered over the handle. The wood felt warm, almost pulsing, like it had a heartbeat of its own. The whispers surged again, louder, more frantic. Ears seemed to buzz, a low hum that made his teeth ache. He turned the handle. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a small, dark room lined with shelves and old storage space, cluttered with forgotten tools, a rusted lantern, tangled ropes. But it wasn't the objects that stole the breath from his lungs. It was the sound of breathing, shallow, wet, ragged breaths, as if lungs that hadn't tasted air in years were gasping from the dark. The flashlight beam jittered across the room, and there they were, Ben and Sophie, standing side by side in the center of the floor, their faces pale, their eyes wide and empty, black pits that seemed to stretch endlessly inward. Their clothes were damp, clinging to their small frames, and water dripped steadily from their fingertips, pooling at their feet. They stared at him, unblinking. Their mouths moved in perfect unison, their voices soft, hollow echoes of themselves. "Come to the water, Daddy. It's waiting for you." Double quotes. Mr. Anderson stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. The whispers surged into a cacophony, a roar inside his head that drowned out everything else. His breath came in sharp gasps, each inhale burning like ice in his chest. Behind him, Mrs. Anderson's scream cut through the noise, a raw, desperate sound that seemed to shake the walls. The cabin groaned in response, the walls pulsing, the floor trembling beneath their feet. The children took a step forward, water dripping from their hands, their eyes locked on their father. "Come with us, Daddy." The light flickered, and the lake's voice echoed through the cabin. Air seemed to collapse in on itself, thick and heavy, as if the cabin were being slowly crushed by an unseen force. Mr. Anderson's chest tightened, every breath a battle, his heart thundering like a drum against his ribs. The soft dripping from the children's fingertips echoed unnaturally loud in the dark, a steady, rhythmic tap that merged with the whispers swirling through the walls. Mrs. Anderson stood frozen at the edge of the hallway, her body trembling, hands pressed to her mouth in horror. Her mind screamed for her to move, to snatch Sophie up, to hold her tight and run far, far away, but her feet felt nailed to the floor, her knees locked in place. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as she stared at the small, pale figures before her. Sophie's lips moved, her voice soft and strange, layered with something else, something older, darker, that seeped into the words like wrath. "Come with us, Mommy. The water's warm. It's waiting." Mrs. Anderson's heart cracked, a sharp, splitting pain in her chest. Her baby's face, pale and wide-eyed, her hair damp and clinging to her forehead, her little hands dripping lake water onto the floor. This wasn't Sophie. She knew it in her bones. This was something else, wearing her daughter's skin like a mask. And yet, her body ached to reach for her child, to hold her close, to make her safe again. Mr. Anderson staggered back a step, his foot catching on the uneven floorboards. The flashlight lay on the ground, its beam sputtering across the children's faces, casting long, flickering shadows behind them. The whispers surged in his head. Come to us. The lake is calling. It's so peaceful in the dark. His vision blurred, the edges of the room bending and warping like a reflection on the surface of the water. He felt dizzy and tethered, as if the floor were tilting beneath him. And then, through the thick fog of whispers, he heard it, a low, rhythmic thump, almost like a heartbeat. It pulsed from beneath the floorboards, deep and slow, vibrating through the wood and into their bodies. The cabin seemed to breathe in time with it, each beat drawing them closer, pulling them toward the lake. Mrs. Anderson's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. She rocked slightly, clutching the crumpled blanket that had once wrapped Sophie. Her voice was a whisper, a broken, pleading mantra. Please, please, no, not my babies. The children took another step forward. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves wafted from them, mingling with the sharp, cold tang of lake water. Ben's mouth opened, and the voice that came out was not his own. It was layered, deep, and hollow, like many voices speaking at once, rising from the bottom of the lake. Ancient and slow. You cannot keep them. They belong to the water now. Mr. Anderson's breath hitched. His knees shook. He fell back against the wall, the air crushed from his lungs by the weight of the voice inside his head. His vision blurred, and he squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the whispers, the images of dark hands reaching up from the depths, pulling his children under, their small faces slipping beneath the water. And in the diary, his eyes snapped open. The old, dust-covered book he'd seen on the cabin shelf. He scrambled to his feet, lurching across the room toward the mantel where it had been. His fingers closed around it, the cover cold and damp beneath his touch. He tore it open, flipping through pages that smelled of mildew and time. The ink smudged and faded. The whispers recoiled for a brief moment, as if the presence of the diary had stirred something deeper, something wary. The air trembled, the children's figures blurring at the edges, their shapes flickering like candle flames. The diary's pages were filled with scrawled entries, some torn, others barely legible. But the words leapt out at him, raw and desperate. The lake whispers at night. Don't listen. Don't look into the water. It will take what you love most. They come back, but they are not the same. Do not let them in. Do not let them speak. Do not follow the footprints. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, the words twisting, overlapping with the whispers in his mind. The final entry, scrawled in a shaky, fading hand, read, "It wants the family. It feeds on the family. Don't let it take them. Don't let it take them. Don't." The page ended in a jagged rip, the ink smeared as if by wet fingers. Mr. Anderson looked up, heart pounding, the whispers pressing hard against his skull, a relentless, gnawing presence. His children, the things wearing their faces, stood motionless now, watching him, waiting. He clutched the diary tightly, breath ragged. His voice cracked a raw, desperate whisper, "Give them back." But the things in front of him only smiled, their teeth too white, too many. The silence after Mr. Anderson's plea was crushing, an emptiness that filled the cabin and seemed to stretch out forever. The things wearing his children's faces tilted their heads slightly, as if listening to something only they could hear. Their smiles widened, stretching in ways that made the skin of their faces seem too tight, their eyes glistening black like the depths of the lake. Mrs. Anderson whimpered softly, curled in on herself on the floor, the crumpled blanket clenched in her fists. "Give them back, give them back." The words echoed in her own voice now, tangled and desperate. Mr. Anderson clutched the diary so tightly the old spine cracked under the strain. His fingers were numb, his breathing ragged. He forced himself to focus on the words etched into the fragile pages, the warnings, the pleas. Don't let them in, don't let them speak, don't follow the footprints. His gaze snapped to the floor. The footprints. They glistened faintly, leading not just from the door, but now curling in a strange spiral across the cabin floor, circling the family like a snare. Each print seemed darker, wetter, as if something was leaking up from beneath the boards. He looked at the children or the things that wore their shapes. Their voices rose in unison, a soft, hollow melody, as they whispered together. The water is waiting, it's waiting for you, it's waiting to take you home. The sound seeped into Mr. Anderson's bones, a vibration low and deep, like the hum of something ancient stirring in the dark. He staggered, dizziness washing over him. The room seemed to tilt, the walls pulsing, bending inward, the floor beneath his feet softening like wet sand. He opened the diary again, desperate for something, anything. And then he saw it. A single line, hastily scribbled in the margin, almost lost in the faded ink. Break the circle. Break the circle before it closes. His eyes darted back to the footprints, the dark spiral coiling tighter, inching closer to the family. The whispers surged, furies now clawing at the edges of his mind. His vision blurred, the air crackling with a strange, cold energy. He stumbled toward the prints, adrenaline surging, and slammed the flashlight down onto the floorboards. The beam flickered weakly, but illuminated the trail. The spiral twisted, winding toward the center of the room like a snake coiling for the kill. The children, those hollow, wet things, let out soft, gurgling sounds, their smiles twitching, their eyes locked on him. Ben's voice, layered with that ancient, dark resonance, murmured, "Too late, Daddy. The water's already inside." But Mr. Anderson roared a raw, desperate sound and lunged forward, slamming his fist onto the floor, breaking the pattern of the prints. He scrambled to smear them out, using his hands, his feet, tearing at the floorboards, leaving streaks of water and dirt and splinters across his skin. The whispers rose into a shriek, a cacophony of rage and hunger, the very air seeming to shudder and quake. Mrs. Anderson's voice broke through, high and sharp. "What are you doing, breaking the circle?" he gasped, not even sure where the words had come from, only that they felt right, felt true. He clawed at the prints, breaking the spiral, tearing it apart, ignoring the sharp sting of splinters embedding into his hands. The children's forms began to flicker, their outlines blurring, the smiles slipping. Their eyes widened, and for a heartbeat, just a heartbeat, they looked like themselves again. Ben's lips trembled, his voice small and broken. "Daddy, it hurts." And then, like a candle snuffed out, they vanished. The wet footprints faded, the whispers faltered, retreating like a wave drawing back into the sea. The cabin shuddered once more, then fell into a heavy, eerie stillness. The air was thick, damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth and old wood. The only sound was the ragged breathing of the Andersons, broken and raw. Mr. Anderson sat on the floor, chest heaving, the diary clutched in one hand, his other scraped and bleeding. Mrs. Anderson crawled to him, her body shaking with sobs, and they clung to each other, trembling in the dark. For a moment, it seemed like it was over. But then, from the direction of the lake, a soft, hollow splash, a ripple spreading across the water, and the whispers began again, softer now, patient, promising, waiting. The cabin sat shrouded in an uneasy silence, broken only by the shallow, uneven breaths of the Andersons. The weight of the whispers had lifted, but the air still buzzed faintly, as if the quiet itself was a living thing watching, waiting. Mr. Anderson's hands trembled where they clutched the diary, the faded pages damp with sweat and streaked with blood from the torn skin of his palms. The book felt heavy, colder than it should have been, as if it carried the weight of every family that had come before. Mrs. Anderson leaned against him, her body racked with quiet sobs. Sophie's blanket lay crumpled at her side, damp and stained. For long minutes, they sat in the dark, too afraid to move, the cabin walls groaning softly as if they, too, were holding their breath. But the silence was an illusion. It started softly, a faint dripping sound, a single droplet striking the floor, followed by another, and then another, the rhythm slow and steady. Mr. Anderson's breath hitched, his eyes snapping to the ceiling. The flashlight, still flickering weakly, cast long, trembling shadows upward. Water, a thin line of it seeping through the ceiling boards, pulling on the floor. His heart sank. The whispers were still there, buried beneath the silence. like the distant sound of waves against the shore. Mrs. Anderson's eyes followed him, wide and glassy, her lips trembling as she tried to speak but no words came. He moved toward the back door, drawn by an invisible pull, the same thread that had tugged at him since they'd arrived. The lake was calling again, patient and insistent, the sound of its voice woven into the hush of the night. The door creaked open slowly, the hinges groaning as if resisting. A cold wind rushed in, sharp and wet, carrying the scent of damp earth and something deeper, something ancient. The lake stretched before him, dark and endless, its surface smooth as glass. The moonlight shimmered across it, but the reflection seemed wrong, warped, as if the water was hiding something beneath. And then he saw it, a figure pale and dripping, standing at the water's edge. Then, his small frame silhouetted against the moonlight, his clothes soaked and clinging to his skin. His eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto his father's. "Daddy?" he called softly, the words stretching out, distorted, like it had been pulled through water. Mr. Anderson's legs moved without thought, his feet dragging across the damp earth, pulled toward the figure by an overwhelming force. The whispers swelled again, filling his head, urging him forward. "Asters, come to us, come into the water. You belong here." Asters behind him. Mrs. Anderson's voice broke into a sob. "No, please, no, don't leave us." Her voice cracked, raw and desperate. But Mr. Anderson could barely hear her over the pull of the lake, the relentless hum of the whispers weaving into his bones. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tight, every step a struggle against the unseen weight dragging him forward. Ben stood still and moving, as the water lapped at his bare feet, the ripples spreading out in slow, deliberate circles. The lake's surface shimmered, dark shapes shifting beneath, like shadows waiting to rise. The whispers grew louder, rising into a soft chant, the words bleeding into one another, an endless, hungry invitation. "Come into the water, come into the dark. It's so peaceful here." Mr. Anderson's feet touched the shoreline, the cold water biting at his skin. The chill seeped through his shoes, up his legs, numbing him, pulling him deeper. "Please, Daddy, come with me." The lake rippled, the water parting slightly, as if something beneath was stirring, waiting to rise. And then, in the beam of a weak flashlight, something glistened. Hands, pale, long-fingered hands, reaching up from beneath the surface. Fingers slick and dripping, stretching toward Mr. Anderson's legs. The water around them trembling as they drew closer. His breath caught, his body freezing in place. The whispers roared, crashing against his skull, a wave of voices screaming in unison. "You're ours now." But in the distance, faint and fragile, he heard a different voice, softer, smaller. "Daddy, don't go." It was Sophie, the real Sophie. Her voice, thin and trembling, from somewhere behind him. It cut through the whispers like a blade, sharp and bright. Anderson's chest heaved, his eyes snapped wide, the fog lifting for a breathless instant. He tore his gaze from the figure at the water's edge, stumbling backward, his feet slipping on the wet ground. The hands beneath the surface lunged upward, missing him by inches, vanishing back into the dark depths with a ripple and a low, wet sigh. Mr. Anderson staggered into the cabin, the door swinging shut behind him with a hollow, final thud. His breath came in ragged gasps, and for a moment, all he could hear was the roar of blood in his ears. The whispers clung to him like wet cloth, dampening his senses, whispering promises he couldn't quite shake. His legs trembled beneath him, each step heavy and uncertain. The flashlight, still sputtering weakly in his grasp, cast wild arcs of dim light across the room. The cabin looked different now, distorted, warped by shadows that pulsed and flickered across the walls. The air felt wrong, thick, oppressive, filled with a low hum that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. Mrs. Anderson crouched near the corner, clutching Sophie's blanket, her eyes hollow, her face streaked with tears. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow bursts. She stared at Mr. Anderson, but it was as if she wasn't seeing him, her gaze distant, unfocused, locked somewhere deep inside herself. And then Sophie's voice again. "Daddy," this time, It came from the darkened hallway. Mr. Anderson's breath caught. His heart raced. His fingers tightened around the diary, knuckles white, the paper edges biting into the skin. The whispers rose again, twining around the sound of Sophie's voice, wrapping it in tendrils of false comfort. "Come to the water. It's safe there, warm, quiet. Come to us." He took a shaky step forward, the floor creaking under his weight. The air pulsed, vibrating faintly, the walls seeming to lean inward. The cabin groaned, the wood bending, the shadows stretching like hands across the floor. The sound of footsteps, small, light, padding across the boards. Sophie's giggle, soft and sweet, floated from the hallway. It was a sound he knew, but twisted now, slowed just slightly, as if played on an old, warped record. "Sophie!" His voice cracked, raw and desperate. He moved toward the sound, each step an effort, as though wading through deep water. The whispers surged, louder now, overlapping in chaotic waves, names, laughter, sobbing, snatches of song, all blending into a terrible, hollow chorus. Mrs. Anderson whimpered from behind him, her voice a soft, broken whisper. "No, don't go. They're inside now." He turned briefly, his eyes wide with fear, but her gaze was locked on the floor, her lips moving in silent prayer. He pressed forward. The hallway stretched before him, the flashlight beam bouncing weakly across the walls. The door at the far end, once closed, now stood slightly ajar, a faint, damp scent wafting from within. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooling at his feet, soaking into the floorboards. The sound of it echoed unnaturally loud in the confined space. "Sophie!" he called again, his voice barely a whisper. A small, pale hand curled around the edge of the doorframe. Sophie's hand, but wrong. The fingers were too long, the skin too smooth, glistening as if it were slick with lake water. Mr. Anderson froze, his breath hitched. The whispers surged, pressing in on all sides. "She's waiting, Daddy, waiting in the water." Then, from behind the door, a second voice, Ben's, layered and deep, almost guttural. "Come in, Daddy. We're all waiting for you." Mr. Anderson's knees buckled, his body trembling. He raised the flashlight, the beam shaking as it landed on the door. His fingers clenched tight around the diary. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out everything except the steady, rising hum of the whispers. And then the door burst open. A wave of cold air blasted out, carrying the scent of wet leaves and decaying wood. The room beyond was dark, but shapes moved within, flickering forms that blurred at the edges, faces that shimmered like reflections on water, eyes gleaming in the dim light. Ben and Sophie stood at the center, their hands clasped together, their faces pale and still. Their mouths moved in perfect unison, their voices soft, laced with that same hollow resonance. "Come to the lake, Daddy. It's waiting for you." The whispers swelled into a deafening roar, the cabin shaking, the floor quivering beneath his feet. The diary in his hand grew warm, hot, almost burning, and a strange pressure built in the air, as if something immense was about to break free. Mr. Anderson's scream tore through the noise, raw and ragged, his voice barely human. The flashlight slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor and spinning, casting wild shadows across the cabin. He fell to his knees, clutching the diary, the words within it seeming to writhe, shifting and pulsing like they were alive. The whispers flooded his mind, drowning him, until the only thing he could hear was the lake, calling, 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 and beneath it all a single, wet knock echoed from beneath the floor. The walls of the cabin trembled, as if straining under an immense, unseen weight. The whispers surged in chaotic waves, no longer soft but fierce, filling the air with a low, pulsing hum that vibrated through the floorboards and into Mr. Anderson's bones. His breath hitched, ragged and shallow, as the voices crowded his mind, overlapping, drowning out his own thoughts until he couldn't tell where his own fear ended and the whispers began. The flashlight lay forgotten on the floor, its beam flickering across the walls like a dying heartbeat. The children, Ben and Sophie, or the things that wore their faces, stood still in the center of the room, their skin pale, glistening wet, their hands clasped tightly together. Their smiles were too wide, their teeth too many, too sharp. Their eyes, dark and endless, reflected no light, only depthless hunger. The cabin creaked and groaned, the walls bowing inward, the ceiling low and heavy. A low moan rose from the floor itself, as though the house were alive, breathing, waiting. Mrs. Anderson sobbed in the corner, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest, rocking back and forth, her voice a faint, broken whisper. "This isn't real, Doc, this isn't real. This isn't real." But it was real. The lake's call vibrated in the air, deep and steady, like a heartbeat beneath the floor. Mr. Anderson scrambled backward on his hands, the diary still clutched tight, the edges digging into his palms. The warmth from the book was searing now, as if it had been dipped in fire. The words inside seemed to shift and pulse, the ink shimmering faintly in the low light. His eyes darted to the front door in escape, a way out. But the door was sealed, the wood pulsing with that same low hum, the handle rattling as though something pressed against it from the outside. The windows, too, were dark, the glass fogged over, slick with condensation, as if the lake's breath had seeped inside. Beyond the glass, shapes moved slow, patient, waiting. Ben's voice rose, layered and strange, his tone flat, mechanical, yet pleading. "Come with us, Daddy. The water is waiting. It's safe there. No more fear, no more pain." Sophie's voice followed, soft and cold. "Please, Daddy, come to the water." Mr. Anderson's chest heaved, his vision blurring. He clutched the diary tighter, feeling the heat radiating from it, burning into his skin. His breath hitched as the whispers swelled, flooding his ears, wrapping around his mind like tendrils of fog. And then the car. His mind snapped to it like a spark. Their car, parked just outside, barely visible through the swirling fog. It was still there. The keys, where were the keys? His pockets. His hands fumbled, shaking, searching blindly. His fingers brushed cold metal. He scrambled to his feet, staggering toward the front door, his body moving on sheer willpower, dragging the crushing weight of the whispers behind him like chains. The door loomed ahead, pulsing faintly, the wood vibrating under an unseen pressure. Ben and Sophie turned to watch him, their heads tilting in perfect unison, their eyes glistening in the dim light. They didn't speak, but the whispers spoke through them, filling the air around him. "You can't leave, it's too late, the lake knows your name." He gritted his teeth, chest heaving, and lunged for the door. His hand closed around the handle, cold, wet, slick. The whispers screamed, a furious, roaring wave, as the shapes outside pressed closer against the glass, their forms shifting, mouths opening in silent, gaping hunger. The door wouldn't open. It rattled under his hand, trembling, but the unseen pressure held it shut. The walls groaned louder, the floorboards bending beneath his feet, the ceiling bowing, the entire cabin quivering like it would collapse in on itself. Mrs. Anderson's voice cracked through the noise, raw and panicked. "Get us out, please, get us out," Mr. Anderson roared, a primal, desperate sound, and threw his weight against the door. The wood creaked, the hinges strained, the handle twisted, but it held fast, as if the lake itself had sealed them inside. And then a crash. The back window exploded inward, shards of glass raining down, carried by a rush of cold, wet air. The cabin seemed to inhale, the air thickening, the whispers surging in triumph. And through the jagged hole, the lake reached in. Water surged across the floor, black and icy, swirling with impossible force. Shapes moved within it, hands, faces, bodies half-formed and writhing, dragging the darkness with them. Mrs. Anderson screamed, clutching the blanket to her chest, as the water licked at her feet, the floor beneath her trembling. Mr. Anderson's breath caught, his mind a tangle of terror and desperation. The children stepped forward, their smiles widening, their hands outstretched. The water curled around them, embracing them, their forms blurring, melting, as if the lake were claiming them once more. The diary in Mr. Anderson's hands grew so hot it scorched his skin, the edges blackening, the pages curling inward. The words seemed to glow now, the ink shifting and pulsing, demanding something, anything to break the spell. The whispers rose into a deafening, ear-splitting crescendo. And the car, his only thought, his only hope, sat waiting just beyond the fog, headlights faintly glimmering like distant stars. If only he could make it. If only he could get them all out. If only the lake would let them go. The cabin groaned beneath the crushing weight of the whispers, the walls trembling as though the lake itself were coiling tighter, wrapping its invisible tendrils around the house. The water surged across the floor in slow, creeping waves, lapping at Mr. Anderson's shoes, seeping into the wood, darkening it like ink spreading on paper. Mr. Anderson's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. His eyes darted wildly between the children Ben and Sophie, or what they had become, standing in the center of the room, the water curling around their ankles. They smiled wide and hollow, their teeth too sharp, their skin glistening wet, as if they had just stepped from the lake's depths. The whispers surged again, not in words, but in feelings of pressure in the skull, a deep ache in the bones, an overwhelming sense of inevitability. The lake wanted them, got it, needed them, and it would not be denied. Mrs. Anderson clung to the blanket, her face streaked with tears, her sobs swallowed by the sound of the cabin itself creaking, bending, as though it were about to split apart at the seams. Her voice cracked through the chaos, hoarse and raw. Please, please, just give them back. The children's eyes flicked to her, their expressions calm, serene. Ben's voice, soft and distant, echoed across the room, layered with the sound of water sloshing against the shore. They don't want to go, Mommy. They're part of the lake now. Sophie's voice followed, sweet and cold, her small hands dripping dark water onto the floor. It's better here, Mommy. So quiet, so still. Mr. Anderson's hands burned where they gripped the diary, the heat searing into his skin. The words on the pages glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the low, heavy hum that filled the cabin. He staggered forward, slipping on the wet floor, the diary nearly tumbling from his grasp. He fell to his knees, the water soaking through his clothes, chilling him to the bone. His voice cracked, low and desperate. Please, please let them go. The whispers surged in response, a deafening wave of sound that pressed against his skull, squeezing, drowning out everything. His thoughts fractured, memories flickering and fading, the sound of Sophie's laughter, the smell of Ben's hair after a bath, the warmth of family dinners all slipping away, replaced by the cold, endless pull of the lake. And then, the cabin began to shake. The walls buckled, the floorboards groaned, and the ceiling above creaked ominously. The water churned, swirling around the children's feet, rising higher, reaching for Mr. Anderson's knees. The shapes beneath the surface grew clearer now, pale hands, faces twisted in silent screams, bodies half submerged, watching, waiting. Mrs. Anderson's scream split the air as the floor beneath her split with a crack, water gushing up through the gap. She scrambled backward, dragging the blanket with her, her hands slipping on the slick floor. The whispers surged into a cacophony, voices overlapping, crying out, pleading, chanting. Let us in. Come to the water. Give them back. Give them back. Mr. Anderson's gaze snapped to the diary. The pages flickered, the words glowing bright, searing into his eyes. A single phrase repeated over and over, scrawled in the margins, desperate, insistent. The circle must be broken. The circle must be broken. He looked at the children, his children, standing silent in the center of the swirling water. His heart twisted, torn between love and dread. His voice was a hoarse, shaking whisper. I love you. I love you so much. Their smiles flickered, their forms shivering, blurring at the edges. The whispers stuttered, faltering for a heartbeat. The air crackled, the walls trembling, the lake outside rippling violently. And then he slammed the diary down into the water, pressing it against the floor, the heat from the pages searing his hands. The words glowed brighter, pulsing, filling the room with an eerie light. The whispers screamed, a high, keening wail that shook the cabin to its foundations. The water surged upward, a wave of cold and dark, swallowing the children's forms. Their faces twisted, mouths opening wide in silent screams as they were dragged down into the floor, their shapes dissolving into the dark. The air shuddered, the walls pulsing like lungs in a final, ragged breath. The cabin shook violently, the floor splitting in places, the water gushing up, and the whispers climaxed in a deafening, bone-deep scream, then stopped. Silence. The water receded slowly, leaving the floorboards wet, dark, and cracked. The air settled, heavy and still, and in the quiet, Mr. Anderson's sobs filled the space, sharp and broken. Mrs. Anderson crawled to him, clutching his arm, her breath shuddering, her eyes wide and hollow. But it wasn't over. Outside the shattered window, the lake gleamed darkly in the moonlight. A ripple spread across its surface, slow and steady, and from beneath something stirred. The stillness that followed was fragile, like the breath held in the moment before a storm. The cabin sat in a tense hush, walls damp, floorboards soaked, the remnants of the lake's invasion clinging to every surface. The air smelled of wet earth and decay, sharp and cold, lingering in the back of the throat. Mr. Anderson knelt on the floor, the diary's scorched pages steaming faintly where they pressed into the damp wood. His hands trembled, blood and water smeared across his palms. The glow from the diary had faded, the ink bleeding into the paper like a final exhale. His breath shuddered in his chest, each inhale a battle against the crushing weight in the air. Mrs. Anderson crouched beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around his shoulders, her sobs soft and broken. The blanket still clutched in her fists dripped water onto the floor, each drop punctuating the silence with a slow, steady rhythm. The children were gone, or so it seemed. A low creak echoed through the cabin, subtle but sharp in the quiet. The floorboards trembled faintly beneath their feet, a ripple moving across the room, as if something massive had shifted beneath the surface. The lake outside shimmered, its dark surface smooth and glassy, reflecting the fractured moonlight in thin, trembling streaks. And then, in the distance, faint ripples began to spread, slow and steady, radiating outward as if something deep beneath had begun to stir. The whispers hadn't stopped. They had simply changed. They were softer now, but deeper, slower. They vibrated through the floor, through the walls, through the air itself, words stretched and drawn out, barely discernible, yet heavy with meaning. A chant, slow and deliberate, rising from beneath the lake, threaded through the bones of the cabin. You can't break the circle. You are part of it now. The lake remembers. The lake keeps what it takes. Mr. Anderson's breath caught in his throat. His vision blurred, the edges of the room warping, bending inward, the cabin seeming to pulse like a living thing. He looked down at the diary in his hands, but the words had faded, the ink smeared into meaningless stains. The air grew colder, the breath in their lungs turning to fog. The lake's presence pressed in, a weight that settled into their chests, sinking deep, pulling them down. Mrs. Anderson's voice was a thin, desperate whisper. "What do we do now? What do we do?" Mr. Anderson's voice cracked, hollow and trembling. I don't know." A soft knock sounded against the cabin wall. Then another dot, slow, rhythmic dot, as if the lake itself was rapping on the door, waiting to be let in. The sound moved first at the walls, then the windows, then beneath the floor. Each knock resonated in their bones, a deep, vibrating pulse that seemed to crawl into their veins. The shapes outside the windows shifted, dark figures barely visible beyond the fog glass. Faces pressed against the panes, pale, hollow-eyed, mouths open in silent screams. Fingers dragged down the glass, leaving streaks of moisture that seemed to pulse faintly, glowing in the dark. The whispers surged again, louder, clearer now. "The lake is inside you now. It remembers. It calls. It takes." Mr. Anderson's vision blurred. His body felt heavy, as though his skin was turning to water, his bones dissolving into the dark. The diary in his hands crumbled, the pages dissolving into damp ash that drifted down in slow, swirling flakes. Mrs. Anderson clutched at him, her hands gripping his arms desperately. No, stay with me. Please stay with me." But he was fading. And then, the final truth pressed into his mind, heavy and cold. The lake was never outside. It had been inside them from the moment they arrived. It had always been inside them. Their whispers, their reflections. The still water. It was a circle, an endless, hungry circle that never truly broke. And the Andersons were part of it now. They had always been part of it. Outside, the lake shimmered, patient and endless, waiting beneath the pale moonlight. The ripples spread wider, deeper, as something unseen beneath the surface stirred once more. And the cabin sat silent, breathing in the dark, waiting, always waiting. The cabin's walls trembled, creaking softly, as if the structure itself were sighing relieved, perhaps, or simply resigned. The air inside felt different now, thicker, colder, infused with something unseen but deeply felt, a weight that pressed into the skin and sank down into the marrow of the bones. The water on the floor had stilled, but the ripples beneath the wood persisted, faint and slow, like the steady pulse of something alive, waiting just out of sight. Mr. Anderson's breath rattled in his chest, each inhale shallow and labored, as if his lungs were fighting the weight of the lake inside him. He sat slumped against the wall, his eyes wide and vacant, the light in them dimming by the second. His hands lay limp in his lap, skin pale and clammy, fingertips pruned as if they'd been submerged in water far too long. His clothes clung damply to his body, heavy with moisture that smelled of the lake, dark, earthy, and cold. Mrs. Anderson sat close by, rocking slowly, the blanket still clenched in her fists, her gaze fixed on the space where the children had stood. Her lips moved in a soft, broken murmur, a half-formed purr that fell apart before it reached her tongue. Her tears had stopped, replaced by a strange, hollow stillness, as if she had cried herself empty and there was nothing left. The whispers lingered in the air, soft now, gentle, almost soothing, like a lullaby sung just beneath the threshold of hearing. They swirled through the cabin, curling into the walls, the floorboards, the breath of the two remaining souls. They whispered of quiet, of peace, of the endless dark beneath the water. They whispered of family, of togetherness, of love twisted and cold, yet offered like a gift. Outside, the lake gleamed under the silver light of the moon, its surface eerily still save for the slow, deliberate ripples that spread outward, as if something massive had just submerged beneath the surface. The shoreline shimmered faintly, the trees leaning closer, their branches swaying in a breeze that didn't touch the cabin. The whispers pressed into him, filling the spaces where his own thoughts had once lived. He felt the pull, the call, faint but insistent, a soft, endless hum that promised release and end to the fear, to the pain, to the desperate struggle. It promised quiet. He felt himself slipping, as if the floor beneath him had turned to water, and he was sinking, drifting downward. The cabin fading, the light dimming, and then, faintly, a sound of voice. Daddy, Sophie's voice, soft and distant, like a ripple across the water, a fading echo in the fog. It drifted from somewhere far away, threaded through the whispers, almost lost, but it was there. Come find us, Daddy. The whisper of the lake folded around it, pressing tight, pulling him down. Come home. Mrs. Anderson's breath hitched, her body shivering, as if she, too, had heard it. Her eyes fluttered closed, her hands slackening, the blanket slipping from her grasp. The cabin dinned, the shadows growing longer, darker, deeper. The walls seemed to bend inward, the ceiling lower, the floor a cold, pulsing heartbeat beneath them. Outside, the lake shimmered, still and endless. The ripples spread wider, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cabin's lights blinked out one by one until there was nothing but the soft, gentle lapping of the water, the hush of the breeze, and the waiting dark. The Andersons were quiet now. The lake was quiet now. And the whispers continued, soft and steady, curling into the night like fog across the water. Waiting, always waiting. The night draped itself over the lake like a heavy curtain, soft and still. The cabin, once full of voices and life, now sat in a hushed embrace, the walls gently creaking as if breathing out a long, quiet sigh. The whispers that had filled the air had softened, fading into the steady rhythm of the water lapping against the shore. The shapes in the shadows seemed to settle, merging with the dark, their hunger quiet for now. The moonlight shimmered faintly on the surface of the lake, casting gentle ripples of silver across the water. The trees swayed softly in the breeze, their leaves rustling in a calm, steady whisper of their own. The air was cooler now, a soft, damp chill that carried the scent of earth and water, and something deeper and ancient quiet that had always been there, waiting beneath the surface. The cabin stood in stillness, the windows dark, the door closed, the porch empty. The air inside was quiet, the tension easing, the heavy pressure lifting like a weight slowly dissolving into mist. The lake's whispers had settled into the walls, like a memory etched into the wood, a soft reminder of the night's haunting embrace. And slowly, as the night stretched on, the world seemed to breathe again. The stars twinkled faintly overhead, the sky deep and dark, and the gentle sounds of the night returned, leaves rustling, a distant owl's call, the soft lap of water against the shore. The cabin slept up, the lake waited, and the night whispered softly into the darkness, a gentle lullaby that faded into the still, quiet dark. The story is over now. Rest your eyes. Breathe slow. Let the night hold you gently.